The hearing room at Capitol Hill wasn't just a room, it was a blazing furnace, where the cold, white LED lights sliced through the darkness like relentless needles. The air was stifling, thick, as if the entire world held its breath before an inevitable explosion. The reporters' cameras flashed incessantly like tiny lightning bolts. Microphones stretched out from the press gallery like ravenous tentacles, ready to devour any sound, a slip of the tongue, a roar, or a moment of collapse. This wasn't an ordinary hearing. This was a fight to the death, where truth and power collided like two mountains crumbling. Who would survive? Who would be crushed? And the question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Would the secrets, buried deep beneath Washington, be dragged into the light? Adam Schiff stepped into the spotlight, confident as a king ascending his throne amidst a storm. He didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, as if he were accustomed to the world pausing to watch him. His hand adjusted his tie, the faint rustle of fabric echoing in the deathly silent room like a subtle challenge. I am the master here. His gaze swept over the rows of lawmakers, across the throng of reporters, sharp as an eagle sizing up its prey. Schiff, once the head of the House Intelligence Committee, was a master at turning hearings into grand performances. He was the playwright, the leading man, and today he stood there with the demeanor of an invincible warrior, ready to crush anyone who dared stand in his way. But if you looked closely, a flicker of unease flashed in his eyes, fleeting like lightning before a downpour, enough to make one wonder. Did he sense the undercurrent rising? When he spoke, his voice was smooth as silk, sharp as a freshly honed blade. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began, his tone polished like a melody rehearsed for hours. "The atmosphere today is rather special, isn't it?" He paused, letting the words dangle like an invitation, then smirked with a cold, cutting smile. "Perhaps because we're witnessing fanatics turn justice into a cheap farce." His sarcasm flowed like a river in flood, aimed squarely at the Durham report, which he dubbed a cheap piece of fiction penned by Trump's lackeys. He named Kash Patel outright, mocking him as a conspiracy peddler now posing as a herald of truth. Each word was punctuated like a hammer strike, each sentence woven with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He stood there, shoulders squared, chin high, as if the entire room should kneel at his feet. But the room didn't entirely bend to his script. A few chuckles rose from the Democratic lawmakers, but they were weak, isolated like dry leaves falling in a cold wind. Nancy Pelosi bowed her head, fingers tapping lightly on the table as if counting down the seconds. Another, Jim Clyburn, gripped his pen tightly, but no ink flowed. His hand froze as if encased in ice. Schiff's allies were present, but their support was as fragile as a pane of glass about to shatter. Reporters in the back whispered. Cameras panned slowly, capturing his every gesture, like hunters waiting for the moment the great beast fell. The air in the room felt like a theater before the final act. The audience waited, but no one was certain whether this king would claim his crown or be dragged into the mud. Schiff pressed on, his voice rising, his words growing sharper like a gladiator brandishing a sword in the arena. He called the Durham report a desperate ploy to cover up failure, mocking its believers as deluded fools living in a fantasy. But beneath the sarcasm lay a subtle unease. Each phrase was a brick in the wall he built to shield himself. He overacted, like a tightrope walker unaware that the rope was fraying. Did he realize the spotlight wasn't solely his? Did he feel that this room with its calculating silence awaited another figure, one carrying a flame that couldn't be extinguished? Then, from the far end of the room, a figure emerged. No fanfare, no flourish, like an undercurrent rising from the ocean's depths. Kash Patel stepped forward, carrying no stack of files, no bustling aides trailing behind. Only the calm of a man who knew he held the winds of fate. His eyes were icy, not from anger, but from certainty. The certainty of someone who had seen the end game before the pieces moved. The room tilted toward him, as if history's fulcrum had shifted in an instant. Schiff remained standing, hands gripping the table's edge, his thin smile hanging on his lips like a mask about to slip. He didn't know he had just opened the curtain on a play he could never control. The fire had ignited, and it would consume everything. The hearing room trembled in silence, not a peaceful quiet, but a sharp stillness, like the wind before a storm. Adam Schiff stood there, hands clenched on the table's edge, his thin smile now a crack on his proud facade. He had just unleashed a torrent of biting sarcasm, turning the Durham report into a punchline and branding Kash Patel a fanatic. He thought he held the upper hand, that this room with its lawmakers, reporters, and lenses was his domain alone. But the air had shifted. A cold gust swept through, not from the windows, but from the room's far end, where a figure stepped forward silently. Kash Patel didn't arrive like a whirlwind. He was a smoldering ember, quiet, unassuming, yet hot enough to burn through every layer of pretense. Patel advanced to the center, his steps slow but steady, like a man crossing a tightrope without glancing at the abyss below. He carried no thick binders, no aides scurrying with chaotic notes. Just him, alone, hands relaxed, eyes cold as melting ice. The room leaned toward him, not because he shouted or raised a fist, but because his calm exuded an irresistible force, the power of someone who didn't need to roar to win. Lawmakers sat up straighter, leather chairs creaking faintly as if groaning under the strain. Reporters hushed, cameras panned slowly toward him, lenses zooming in like wolves scenting blood. Schiff stood firm, but his grip tightened, his gaze wavered briefly, a hairline fracture in the wall of arrogance he'd built over years. When Patel rested his hand on the wooden podium, his fingers loose yet deliberate, the room seemed to stop breathing. He didn't begin with a bellow or a grand proclamation. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but each word landed like a stone on a still chest. After 6 years of deception, distortion, and carefully rehearsed lines, he started, eyes locked on Schiff. You step in here not to defend America, but to salvage the dying embers of your reputation. The words fell like a burning coal, shaking the stagnant air. Kevin McCarthy furrowed his brow, lips pursed as if stifling a smirk. A Politico reporter murmured to a colleague, "He's not messing around." But Patel didn't pause. He didn't need theatrics. He had the truth, and the truth was a fire no one in this room could quench. Then came the moment of reckoning, swift and ruthless as lightning in a clear sky. Patel raised his hand, not to accuse, but to signal, a simple gesture carrying the weight of an irrevocable verdict. The large screen at the front blazed to life, its pale blue glow washing over every face, from lawmakers to the press horde. 2 videos appeared side by side, one of Schiff in 2017 on CNN, younger, brasher, his voice ringing with pride. "I've seen clear evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia." Those words had once set the nation ablaze, convincing millions that a grand conspiracy had been unmasked. Then the screen shifted, revealing another Schiff. Under oath, his voice softer, faltering. "No, I didn't really see any direct evidence." 2 versions of the same man, 2 statements clashing like day and night, laid bare before the world. The room erupted in silence. Not shouts, not applause, but a collective shock that vibrated through the air. A sharp exhale came from behind, perhaps a young aide unable to hold it in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez bowed her head, hand over her mouth as if witnessing a catastrophe. Cameras swung toward Schiff, capturing his face, flushed red as if scorched, lips pressed into a tight line, eyes narrowed as if clawing for an escape amid the ashes. But there was no escape here. Patel didn't need to say more at that moment. He let the videos speak, let the truth flare up like an unquenchable flame. But he wasn't done. He held the winds of fate, and they hadn't stopped blowing. "This isn't a mistake," Patel continued, his voice still low but now cutting, like a gust slicing through thick fog. "This isn't a misquote. This is a lie spoken to the nation, repeated on every screen, and shielded by the reputation of a man who once stood in this very room." He leaned forward, not to threaten, but to drive the point home. A slight move that made the room feel the fire creeping closer. "You told the American people you had proof. You swore under oath you didn't. You didn't just deceive the public, you deceived this Congress." The words struck like lightning, quiet yet powerful enough to shake every soul listening. Schiff sat there motionless, but it was no longer the stillness of confidence. It was the paralysis of a man whose flame had been snuffed out. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles whitening like cold ash, His face grew redder, not from rage but from pressure. The pressure of truth burning him from within. Behind him, Democratic lawmakers avoided his gaze, eyes averted as if they'd just seen a mountain collapse. One folded a stack of papers, as if to bury the moment in shadow, but there was no shadow here. The LEDs blazed on, cameras rolled, and the truth stood unrelenting. Patel stepped back, not to rest, but to let the room feel the heat of what had just transpired. He didn't smile, didn't smirk, showed no trace of triumph on his face. He simply stood, hands in pockets, his gaze sweeping the space like a lighthouse amid a sea of fire. The world knew Schiff had lost, not because Patel shouted louder, not because he outacted him, but because he had evidence, and evidence was a wind no one in this room could halt. But this wasn't the end. Patel's fire still burned, and the next strike would sear even deeper. The room held its breath, waiting, for they knew this battle had only begun, and the ashes were still falling. The hearing room sank into an eerie silence, not the calm of peace, nor the hush of anticipation, but the stillness of a furnace witnessing its first blaze. Kash Patel had just landed a fatal blow with two contradictory videos of Adam Schiff, one from 2017 boldly claiming proof of Trump-Russia collusion, and another from 2020 mumbling an admission of nothing under oath. The truth had erupted like an unquenchable fire, leaving Schiff seated, immobile, like a stone mountain split in two. But that mountain didn't crumble instantly. It cracked, slowly, ash falling piece by piece under the cold LED glare, before dozens of lenses trained on him. Schiff remained seated, shoulders rigid, hands balled into fists so tight his knuckles gleamed like pale ash. His face was flushed, not with anger, but with strain, the strain of truth pressing down on him like an unstoppable undertow. His eyes narrowed, searching for a foothold in a room that had become a furnace with no exit. He was no longer the conductor. He was the prey, hemmed in by the lights and the silence of his own ally. Behind him, Democratic lawmakers bowed their heads, gazes dodging away as if they'd just seen their idol consumed by flame. Hakeem Jeffries quietly folded his papers as if erasing the moment. Ted Lieu clutched his pen, but his trembling hand betrayed the unease he couldn't voice. No one rose to defend him. No one dared. Patel stood not far off, hands in pockets, his gaze sweeping the room like a chill wind over a pile of ashes. He didn't smile, didn't smirk. No hint of victory crossed his face. His calm wasn't a mask. It was a smoldering ember, burning deeper than any roar could reach. He stepped back, not to pause, but to let the room absorb the heat of what had happened. The two videos lingered in everyone's minds, twin bolts striking Schiff's credibility, leaving him isolated in a furnace that was no longer his kingdom. But Schiff wouldn't yield, not yet. He couldn't. He was a warrior seasoned by the spotlight, adept at turning ashes into phoenixes with florid words and honed arrogance. He drew a deep breath, chest swelling as if reclaiming the air the room had scorched away. His hands left the table's edge, trembling briefly before he forced them still on the polished wood. He lifted his head, striving to reclaim the poise of a king, pushed back but not yet fallen. "You don't defend America." Patel's words echoed in his mind, sharp as a wind cutting through the dark. He knew he had to strike back, not because he could win, but because he couldn't let himself look like a man already burned to cinders. But with what? When the truth blazed, raw and unforgiving, like a fire that wouldn't die. Patel didn't give him long to think. He took a step forward, unhurried, unrushed, each footfall resounding like a drum of doom in the silent room. "Let's turn the pages of your play," he said, voice low but clear like an undertow rising from the deep. "You leaked to the press, hid behind anonymous sources, turned whispers into wildfires across the nation." The big screen flared again, this time with a cascade of old headlines. Anonymous source, Trump colluded with Russia, Schiff. Evidence beyond circumstantial. Each line a glowing ember hurled at Schiff. The room shuddered, not from noise, but from the heat of what was being exposed. A CNN reporter whispered, "This isn't a hearing, it's a furnace." Schiff fought to keep his face stern, but a twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed a crack in his arrogant mask. Patel pressed on, his voice steady, each word heavy as stone on a chest. You cradled the steel dossier, a thing forged in dirty money, and made it your sacred flame. You brought it here, quoted it in hearings, murmured it to the press, and never asked if it was real, because you didn't care about truth, only how long it would burn. The words crashed like a wave, quiet yet shaking the room. Jim Jordan smirked, eyes glinting as if justice had flickered to life. But on the Democratic side, no one looked up. They knew, they felt, that Schiff was more alone than ever. Cameras panned slowly to Schiff, catching every bead of sweat rolling from his temple, his eyes narrowing as if seeking an escape through the flames. He opened his mouth, but only a faint, shaky breath escaped. He couldn't rebut, couldn't shout. Any word now would be the groan of a mountain collapsing. Patel tilted his head slightly, not to mock, but to observe, watching his prey slowly char beneath the heat of the lies he'd ignited. You signed off on FISA warrants, Patel continued, his voice now cold as melting ice. Warrants that never should have passed, built on information you knew was ash. You surveilled American citizens and called it defending democracy. The words weren't just an accusation, they were a chilling wind, and the room felt their weight. The air grew denser, as if the walls themselves smoldered, pressing in on everyone inside. Reporters stopped scribbling, eyes glued to Schiff like they were watching a flame flicker out. A Democratic aide, pale-faced, slipped from his seat, fleeing the furnace in silence. Schiff sat there, but he was no longer the man who'd entered with a king's swagger. He was a heap of ash, trapped between a glorious past and a brutal present. Patel didn't need to shout to win, he just stood there, letting the truth slowly incinerate Schiff like a fire needing no wind to burn. But the story wasn't over. The wave was still coming, and the final blow would be even more devastating. The room held its breath, waiting, for they knew this was just the beginning of the unraveling. The hearing room was no longer a furnace. It was a theater of disintegration, where the cold LED lights illuminated every falling ash from the mountain once called Adam Schiff. Kash Patel had struck lethal blows, lightning bolts from clashing videos to accusations of leaks, the Steele dossier, and flawed FISA warrants. Schiff sat there, still, like a warrior pierced through the heart, yet straining to stand for one last glimmer of light. Sweat dripped from his temple to his chin, his eyes narrowed as if digging for an escape amid the roaring flames around him. But there was no way out, no allies, no crown, just the naked truth staring him down like an unstoppable wind. The room was silent, but it was the silence of an undertow gathering strength. Democratic lawmakers behind Schiff wouldn't look up, their eyes fixed on the table or darting away like witnesses to an incineration they couldn't halt. An aide slipped out, steps faltering as if fleeing a mountain's collapse beyond saving. Reporters murmured, cameras panned slowly to Schiff, capturing every detail. Sweat beads, pursed lips, trembling hands he could no longer hide. Patel stood nearby, hands in pockets, his icy gaze sweeping the room like a wind over ashes. He didn't smile, didn't smirk. His calm was the most terrifying flame, burning deeper than any bellow could. But Schiff couldn't let himself crumble without a fight. He was a seasoned warrior, used to forging phoenixes from ashes with sharp words and tempered arrogance. He took a deep breath, chest heaving as if reclaiming the air the room had burned away. Then he stood, not slowly as before, but abruptly, fiercely, like a volcano erupting one last time before fading. His chair scraped back with a piercing screech, echoing like a death knell. He leaned into the mic, so close his ragged breaths rasped through the speakers, urgent and furious. "You sit there," he roared, voice shattering like cracked stone, smug, self-righteous, as if you've struck gold from a pile of ash. His words weren't a counterstrike. They were the groan of a dying flame. He jabbed a finger at Patel, trembling like it was caught in a gust, eyes blazing red as if to torch everything in sight. "I fought for the truth," he shouted, his voice no longer smooth but jagged, broken, like a wind snapped in a storm. "I stood up when others cowered. I warned this nation when your party turned a blind eye to Russia's meddling." He slammed his hand on the table, the bang-bang ringing like breaking rock, jolting the room. An aide nearby, Jane Rowe, leapt up, hand over her mouth as if stifling a scream. Camera zoomed in, capturing his face, no longer arrogance, but raw disintegration, eyes wild like a hunted man. Patel stood motionless, hands still in pockets, gaze unwavering. He didn't flinch, didn't react. He just watched, a lighthouse in a sea of fire. His calm wasn't indifference, it was a declaration, "You're not worth my movement." But Schiff didn't stop. The louder he yelled, the more his voice cracked like a stone mountain crumbling under pressure. "You call me a liar?" he bellowed, voice hoarse as bent metal. "Where were you when Russia attacked our democracy? I didn't hide behind secret memos. I fought." He slammed the table again, harder, as if to shatter it all, the table, the truth, or the flame he once was. The room quaked under his fury, but no one was swayed. Schiff's shouts weren't strength, they were desperation, the wail of a mountain knowing it had lost, yet refusing to yield. Matt Gates shook his head, eyes glinting with pity and disdain. A reporter from the Hill whispered, "He's done." Cameras panned to Patel, his face still ice, no crease, no blink. Then he leaned forward just a fraction, enough for his low voice to ripple like a final undertow. "You didn't fight for the truth," he said, letting the words hang like a cold wind. "You fought to burn it. And when it refused to char, you lashed out at anyone daring to fan its flames." The words weren't loud, didn't thunder, but they pierced deeper than any of Schiff's cries could. And then, the unimaginable happened, a moment that shook the room and the nation watching on screens. Schiff broke. His mouth twitched violently, hands shook as if scorched. Then he screamed one last time, voice raw as crushed stone. "This is a farce," he howled, pointing at Patel like a madman in a tempest. "A play staged by those shielding a criminal president." He yanked the papers from the table, sheets scattering like ash in the wind, then pounded them down one final time, bang, 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 as if to incinerate everything. His gasping breaths rasped through the mic, frantic, feral, like a beast cornered with no escape. But no one feared him anymore. They watched, stunned and silent, as a volcano erupted its last before turning to ash. Then Schiff did the unthinkable. He spun around, his chair screeching back like a wounded animal's cry, papers fluttering to the floor like the ashes of a once proud empire. "I'm done," he muttered, voice low but sharp as a blade through the mic, then bolted from the room, steps quick and panicked like a man fleeing the fire he'd lit himself. Aides scrambled after him. One, John Doe, tried to grab the falling papers, but stumbled, hands trembling as if burned. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters surged up, cameras chased Schiff's shadow, phones flared like wildfire spreading. A C-SPAN technician whispered, "My God, he's really running." Schiff's chair sat empty, mic still live, a cold ash heap in a theater echoing with collapse. Patel stood still, unmoving, no nod, no smile. He just watched, eyes cutting through the room like a frigid wave in a sea of flame. Then he spoke, voice low but resonant as a final gust. "Truth doesn't scream, it doesn't pound tables, it doesn't flee. Truth stands firm." The words fell like a last bolt of lightning, nailing Schiff's fate to history's ashes. The room held its breath, not from fear, but because they'd just seen a mountain fall, and a man rise from the cinders, needing no crown to triumph. But is this truly the end? Was this truth's victory, or just another act in Washington's endless theater? The answer lies ahead, in a wind no one can see. What do you think?